welcome to Geopolitics Demystified. I'm your host S.L. Canthan. Today's topic, propaganda and censorship, how America dominates information war. If you ask people around the world to describe the USA with a single word, freedom would probably be in the top 10. While there is some truth to it, the US has also gained this reputation through extremely sophisticated propaganda and clever censorship, not to mention by constantly accusing other countries of lacking sufficient freedom. The illusion of freedom is vital for US foreign policy, since all of its wars since World War II are based on claims of spreading freedom and democracy. Understanding how the US wages information war and maintains its soft power is very critical. Let's dive into it. History of American propaganda. For more than a century, the US has understood and fine-tuned mass psychology better than anyone else. It started with Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud. While Freud focused on individuals, Bernays pioneered the field of modern public relations, i.e., manufacturing consent and manipulating the entire society. His seminal book, Propaganda, starts off thus: the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of, the book read. Bernays applied his principles equally to the corporate world, politics, and wars. For example, a cigarette company, Lucky Strikes, approached him in 1929 for help in expanding their business. Bernays organized a protest by wealthy women who marched while smoking in New York City. He reframed smoking as women's liberation and had the media describe it as torches of freedom. Within days, women all across the U.S. were gathering to smoke in public. Bernays used his techniques to help U.S. presidents win elections and even wage wars. An illustrative example is how Bernays helped the CIA stage a coup in Guatemala in the 1950s. Much of the land in Guatemala was owned by American firms like United Fruit Company, which ruthlessly exploited the workers. Thus, when a popular and democratically elected Guatemalan leader, Jacobo Arbenz, wanted to enact land reforms and improve the conditions of his people, he was targeted by the U.S. Bernays helped the CIA launch a propaganda campaign which accused Arbenz of being a communist who colluded with the Soviet Union and threatened America's security. This helped drum up public support in the U.S. for a regime change operation. The CIA even launched a radio station in Guatemala to spread fake news and foment an uprising. Soon, the U.S. invaded Guatemala and installed a brutal dictator who banned labor unions, committed mass murder, and sold off his country to American corporations. Brutality of American empire. The Guatemalan playbook has been utilized many times in Latin America, where almost every country has been a victim of invasions or coups orchestrated by the USA. Shockingly, the US even established the so-called School of Americas to train Latin American soldiers and military generals on political oppression, police state, death squads, torture, psychological warfare, and other means to maintain totalitarian systems. After World War II, the CIA even established rat lines for thousands of high-ranking Nazis to flee to South America and Central America, where the Nazis played a key role in maintaining the Monroe Doctrine, i.e., U.S. domination of the Western Hemisphere. An infamous Nazi in this role is Klaus Barbie, also known as the Butcher of Lyon in France, who established right-wing paramilitary groups such as the Fiancés of Death in Bolivia. He staged coups to install U.S.-friendly fascist leaders, and he killed communists who would impede profits of American corporations, and even helped the CIA with massive cocaine trafficking. There are countless such stories in Africa and Asia as well. The U.S. has armed, funded, and supported a vast majority of dictators and fascists around the world. In an Orwellian manner, the only time a leader is guaranteed to be accused of being a dictator is when he refuses to obey the diktats of the U.S. Otherwise, the mainstream media ignores the sins of such leaders who can even come to the White House for a photo op. More egregiously, the U.S. gladly funds and arms violent militants, neo-Nazi mercenaries like in Ukraine, Islamist jihadists like in Syria and Afghanistan, drug cartels like in Central America, to overthrow governments around the world. Finally, the U.S. also organizes color revolutions and soft coups to remove independent leaders and install puppet leaders. So, the obvious question is, how does the U.S. get away with all this? More importantly, how does the U.S. maintain its global brand as a country that fights for freedom and democracy? It is imperative that every person understand this highly sophisticated combination of capital, technology, and psychology that underpins American propaganda. 3 pillars of American propaganda. While propaganda within a selected group or even a country is somewhat easy, global propaganda at scale requires a much bigger arsenal of diverse weapons. The 3 pillars of American propaganda are dominance of tools. These include traditional mediums such as newspapers, magazines, books, academic publications, TV, movies, music, and so on. Then there are modern tools such as social media, Wikipedia, and Google search. This virtual monopoly of all these tools allows the U.S. to flood the world with American perspectives and drown out competition. The West gets to write the history and define truth. Consistent messaging. While the U.S. media pretends to be independent, it's an important branch of the U.S. establishment. While the media criticize the politicians on different domestic issues, they are always in sync with the imperialist side of the USA. During the illegal war on Iraq, the media shamelessly repeated all the lies from the U.S. military and the deep state. Perhaps 1 in 1,000 mainstream media articles gently question the war propaganda of the military-industrial complex. In the 1970s, the U.S. Senate exposed Operation Mockingbird, which was the CIA's scheme to have agents and collaborators in all the influential media. That arrangement is still alive. Number 3, targeted censorship. Most people don't see censorship in the US because the average person can go on Twitter or Facebook and post some rude things about the US or its leaders. However, what these people don't realize is that if they are influential, they would be censored in numerous ways. Let's analyze each one of them in more details. Domination of mainstream narrative around the world by the US and its allies is astounding. Reuters and AP provide the foreign news to most countries who lack the capacity to have worldwide journalists. The US also has hundreds of influential magazines and newspapers which mold the perceptions of people on economics, geopolitics, social values, and virtually all topics. Wherever you travel, you can find CNN on TV screens at hotels and airports. In India, the number one English TV channel is CNN. Of course, Hollywood plays as big a role as the news media when it comes to manipulating the masses. The Pentagon and the CIA work closely with Hollywood to insert inconspicuous propaganda into movies and TV shows to portray the US as the freedom-loving hero and the geopolitical rivals as bad. Compare Superman, Spider-Man, and James Bond to the countless villains with Russian accent. The US government and corporations, especially the military contractors, fund numerous think tanks in the US and around the world to shape the opinions of influencers, academics, bureaucrats, and the educated class. Moreover, ruling classes from around the world send their children to study in the US, UK, thus indoctrinating the future generation with a narrow and distorted view of the world. The US also spends a lot of money on fake NGOs, which are supposedly non-governmental organizations that train journalists and activists who will unsurprisingly turn out to be pro-US. So people don't question if some organization is called an NGO, how come it's getting funded by the government of the US? That question, for some reason, is totally ignored. The West also controls in indirect ways textbooks and curriculum around the world. Many people don't realize this. Whether it's Germany or India, you will not find a high school or college course on American imperialism. A shocking example of this brainwashing is Hong Kong's young generation, which grew up worshipping the British and never learning the true nature of British colonialism and apartheid in Hong Kong. Sadly, these kids were also taught to hate mainland Chinese people. Finally, all this American wisdom is magnified through American technology and propaganda tools such as Google search and Wikipedia. To summarize, the US floods the world with their propaganda through every channel possible. A person needs to be really dedicated to sift through the flood of disinformation to seek the truth. Vast majority of people don't have the time, money, or patience to go beyond the headlines, mainstream talking points, or the second page of Google search results. Next is consistency. Incredibly, all the channels we discussed above stick to the US establishment propaganda. This happens in a supposedly land of free speech and free press. As Noam Chomsky once said, any dictator would admire the uniformity and obedience of the US media. There are 3 more characteristics to American propaganda which makes them very effective. 1. They are simple. Number 2. They are emotional. Number 3. They are repeated endlessly. American propaganda is the same whether they're selling Nike, or politicians, or neoliberal economics, or wars. They are summarized in catchy slogans. Just do it. Free market and small government. Make America great again. Spreading freedom and democracy. They're also emotional. Whether the lie is about, say, the Syrian President Assad using chemical weapons, or China brutally killing people in the Tiananmen Square, the narrative is so emotional that people cannot think objectively. Propaganda is just marketing. Every good commercial has an emotional appeal to it. Thus, while marketers use sexy women to sell Coca-Cola, warmongers evoke fear and anger to sell war. Thus, portraying Putin as taking over Europe or Xi Jinping taking over Asia are effective in creating fight or flight reactions. Americans have also been trained to have Pavlovian response to words such as dictator and Hitler, which are used against every leader that the US targets. Such simplistic messages are effective because one can see people on social media mindlessly repeating them like robots. Look at the favorable view of China in the US. It fell from 53% in 2018 to just 15% in 2023. Think about it. It took just 5 years to get Americans ready for a war with China. What has China done differently in the last 5 years? Nothing. All the trade wars and tech wars were started by the US, not by China. Also, China didn't build military bases around the US or call the US an adversary. However, everyone in the US establishment started calling China the greatest enemy and biggest threat, and people simply believed it. That's the power of American propaganda. It's really stupid, emotional, and childish, but works impressively to manufacture consent for wars. Finally, the American censorship is very clever and takes on numerous forms. For example, demonetization of YouTube accounts, throttling of Twitter accounts, that is, reducing the views, outright ban for thought crimes, which has increased exponentially after the Trump phenomenon in 2016, firing people from jobs. For example, the CEO of a tech company was recently fired for retweeting a satire article about Israel bombing Gaza, and so on. Journalists such as Chris Hedges, who spoke out against the Iraq War, have been ostracized forever. Recently, he was also fired from a so-called progressive magazine for him being pro-Palestine. Others, such as John Mearsheimer, who have blamed NATO expansion for antagonizing Russia, are just politely ignored by mainstream media. However, people like Scott Ritter and Pepe Escobar, who speak too much truth, have been permanently banned from most social media platforms. Russia's RT America was shut down in the US, and all Russian media have been banned in Europe. US media even attacks the expats who live in China and share their positive views about China. Because if you're not vehemently spewing anti-China narratives, you are a propagandist. As a personal anecdote, I got permanently banned from Medium for simply writing a factual article that questioned the outrageous U.S. allegations of Uyghur genocide in China. When the UN Human Rights Group, led by Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile, went to Xinjiang and later published a report that said nothing about genocide, U.S. politicians went berserk and attacked her viciously. Soon she amended the report to add one line that crimes against humanity may have occurred in Xinjiang. Then the U.S. politicians were happy and she resigned. Similarly, when the ICC wanted to look into American war crimes, the US threatened to arrest the ICC judges. Later, the US bullied the ICC to get rid of the chief judge, installed a puppet, and then indicted Russian President Putin on fake charges. Now, fast forward a couple of years, the ICC is on the verge of indicting the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and then already the US is putting a lot of pressure on the ICC to not indict Netanyahu. The hypocrisy and duplicity are astonishing. By the way, the US did the same with UN inspectors when they said Iraq had no nuclear weapons 2 decades ago. Julian Assange, of course, is the ultimate example of US censorship. All WikiLeaks did was to publish 100% authentic documents, which exposed how the world works. However, the US empire went berserk, framed him with false rape allegations, trapped him in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years, had the UK psychologically torture him in prison, and even tried to kill him. And he's not even an American. Conclusion: perception is reality, is a famous American saying. When applied excessively, this principle would lead to an insane society detached from reality. And in a way, that is exactly what is happening in the US. Americans do not realize that they live in an oligarchic and kleptocratic system where politicians are bought and paid for by large corporations. Thus, Americans keep falling for fake elections and staged drama, even though the life of an average American has gotten worse consistently over the last 5 decades. Similarly, Americans keep supporting perpetual wars and a vast empire of 800 international military bases because they naively believe the recycled war propaganda. There is definitely more awakening in the rest of the world, especially in the global south. People are starting to see through American propaganda and disinformation, as evidenced in the world's recent support for Russia and Palestinians. However, more people need to wake up, especially Europeans and Americans. The next decade will be dangerous for the world since the rulers of the US will try every imperialist trick to destroy their geopolitical competitors and prolong the American unipolar hegemony. Be prepared for intense propaganda wars. The end. Thank you.